kind of give an example of how I scout and how I go into the season all the way through until the end of the season. So as far as getting on deer and like trying to figure out what they're doing, most of the time that changes by the time the season opens anyways. So that is not something that I really focus on. Half the time it's out there just sweating and getting spider webs in your face and everything. So most of my scouting takes place in the late season, like before turkey season. I'm sure a lot of you probably already do that. That's not new information. But when you're walking in the woods in the summertime, you can jump a buck or a bachelor group, and you don't even know that you've done it because it's so thick, sound doesn't carry as much, and they can run off, and unless you catch a glimpse of them, you don't even know that you've ran into a group of deer. So it's not a bad thing to be in the woods in the summertime, it's just not something I do. I would rather get out there after season ends, look for some sheds. Scrapes are really visible, rubs are really visible, and if you jump a deer, you can see it from 200 yards away and then go up there and figure out what it was doing and kind of get real-time information. So like I said, as we go through this, feel free to stop me. It's not going to throw me off or anything, but I basically want to go through my season chronologically and show y'all how from bow season all the way to late season, my favorite times of the year, areas that I struggle, and then I want to emphasize that I don't have it all figured out by any means. I'd be glad to learn from y'all as y'all learn from me, because I listen to podcasts just like everyone else here, and I think it's good to listen to people because you may not learn from everything they say, but if you could pick up a tidbit of information and kind of backlog it as you're out there in the woods, a lot of times it'll come back to you, so you can learn as you go. So as you can see, it's kind of an open landscape here. That's a picture I took from one of the mountain ranges I hunted. But I want to kind of show a contrast here. This is obviously the opposite of what I hunt. I hope to kind of venture out into this a little bit more and hunt suburban areas. But as you can see here, I have a laser pointer, but I don't think it's going to work, so I'll use the cursor here. This is an area, to me, that would be very simple to break down in a suburban area. You got your power line here, your river bottom, all these houses. Your small creek drainages that come up through the houses. Is kind of a bit quicker to break down, and some of the harder points of this would be getting permission and hunting those areas. So that's a lot more simple, but when you see this next slide here, okay, so this is a lot different, and are anyone here from the southeast or Georgia specifically that hunt? Okay, there's one back there. So this might be familiar to you. When you see something like this, it doesn't appear like there's a lot of variables here. It's just a vast landscape. So as I started hunting areas like this, it's immediately like, where do I go in somewhere like this where it's just a vast landscape of nothing but mountains? So I'm going to go through my season on how I start from bow season and then go throughout the year. So this is a picture I took in preseason, right about the September time date, and a lot of the area looks like this, and anyone that hunts the mountains or the southeast will tell you this is the toughest time to kill a deer whenever they can pretty much live wherever they want. So some of you have heard the Native Habitat Project guys talk about native browse and everything, and when the landscape looks like this, when everything's green and luscious and there aren't many limiting factors, it can be really tough to locate areas that bucks are in. So in the early season, it's really tough. I've only killed a couple bucks in early season. I'm not afraid to admit that. It's just really hard to narrow them down. So some areas that I focus on are trails near bedding areas. So in certain areas of the country that I hunt, a lot of the places that I've traveled to, it's like everyone focuses on food in the evenings. In the mountains, I don't mind hunting in the mornings whenever they're coming back to their beds. The struggle with early season is that a lot of times they're in a rush, it's single file. It's not like later in the season where I prefer to hunt. So it's a big issue of timing there whenever it's an early season, because the acorns aren't dropping yet. They're focused more on the vegetation, and they're pretty much A to B, food to bed, and then they hang out in an area throughout the day. So this is an example of a trail at the bottom edge of a laurel thicket at the lower end of a drainage, and this one's pretty defined. I don't know if you could see it kind of in the center there, but this would be an area that I would key in on as bucks are coming out in the evening or going out, going out in the morning or coming back in the evening, or vice versa. That would be a good area to start on. So here's another example of where you can see there's a buck bed there. There's 2 or 3 rubs. Those are actually not from when I took that picture. They're from the year before. So that's kind of a historical site. You can see the buck bed there in the middle, and that's in a laurel thicket. So that's kind of an example there in the early season where I might try to target bucks because it is so just one-dimensional, A to B. Another thing is, another bedding site that you might find is in the mountains, a north-facing slope that kind of stays shady. This is an example where we had some hurricane winds come through and knock over a bunch of trees. You can see all that greenery that grew up. They will bed in that. They will feed on all that native stuff that you've heard other people talk about. So there's a different trail that you can see that's actually higher up the mountains leading into that. So as you can see there, this is a lot higher elevation. This is an example of a buck bed that trail might lead to. It's kind of nestled up there, kind of a shelf with a bank to the back of it there. So there's an example of a buck bed. That's a great transition area that you can hunt in early season, but like I said, this is not where my confidence is at. So this is an area that a lot of people are going to struggle in the southeast. So here from an aerial view, as you go into early season, you want to map scout before you even put boots on the ground. This is an example. As you can see here, there's an isolated patch of laurel thicket, which is where I just showed you those beds in. And down here, there's some wildlife openings. This is on a wildlife management area where they actually cut some trees down. But in a lot of the big woods, you won't even have that. You'll just have creek bottoms. So there's a couple drainages leading up to that. I should have a LiDAR image coming up here that shows where they might travel between those wildlife openings down here in the bottom. And then you can see these micro drainages leading up to that laurel thicket at higher elevation. So anywhere in between here would be a great transition area to hunt between the bottoms and the actual bedding area in the laurel thicket. Now if you're not specific to the Appalachians, you may not even notice that terrain type because it might be something different. It may not be laurel thicket in your area. So this is going to apply to different areas of the southeast differently because you may not have the same type of habitat. So oftentimes trail cameras in the early season don't mean as much to me as they do as we move throughout the season, because throughout the season I start using scrapes more, and that's where I get my confidence. So early season, a lot of my trail camera pictures look just like this. It's bucks in single file, A to B, food to bed. So you got to really be on the X there to kill one in the early season when you're dealing with that vast landscape. So it's that's where a lot of the challenge comes from. So this is an example of one that I killed in early season. You can see they're not single file there, but they're moving quick. You don't have a lot of shot opportunity because they're wanting to get from food to bed pretty early. So in this example, it was actually raining that morning, which oftentimes when it's raining and there's any sort of precipitation in early season, you tend to see movement earlier in the day and the evening, and then later into the morning.
Before we move on to this October pre-rut, what questions does everybody have on the early season that we just covered?
So what are you highlighting food-wise early season? You said A to B, food to bed. What are you highlighting in Appalachian Mountain?
So a lot of times I haven't got quite to the part where the actual hard mast is falling, like where you have your acorns on the ground, and it's a little bit more easy to identify that. Like the initial picture I showed where it looks like a jungle, that's kind of what you're dealing with in the early season. So this is all Georgia, so it's like, you know, all the month of September, so it still kind of looks like the summertime. Sometimes you have some early white oaks dropping or maybe some beech nuts, but for the most part they're still feeding on you know, the native browse. So they're pretty much getting up from their beds where they kind of stayed all day without eating a whole lot, and then they're going down in the bottoms a little bit. So there's really not a lot of movement there. But to answer your question, some of the stuff I'm about to cover might answer some of that, and then we can go further into that after I cover the October part of that. So, okay, so in October, this is starting out with a LiDAR image here, and slightly different from how I might look in September. This is a ridge example that I gave here, where you have a slightly larger creek bottom, more drainages, and then farther over here, there's kind of a slight saddle. So as we shift into October, the acorns start dropping, so it's no longer just the native browse where you might be scouting for browse lines where they're just kind of eating on the green leaf stuff. So in the mountains, a lot of times, the white oaks are all in the bottoms. You don't find them very high elevation. That's where you find like your red oaks and stuff. So the bucks will be in the bottoms. You'll find a lot of sign there, which we're going to cover. But as far as getting them in daylight in the bottoms, it's pretty much a 0% chance there. I'm not saying you couldn't kill one there, but I wouldn't waste any time there. So I would rather focus on areas close to the bottoms, as you can see on the left side of the screen, and then on the right side of the screen you have more drainages coming up and leading into that saddle. So that would be an area where I would try to catch them in daylight, maybe coming back to bed. This is what it might look like on the ground. As you can see on the right side there's a big tree falling. And then as it pans through, you'll see some more trees falling farther down below. So you might find an area like that on a map and get in there, and then you're trying to narrow down, say it's still bow season, you're trying to pick out a tree once you're in there. These are features that you can find on the ground, whether it be rocks on the ground or blowdowns like this, where the deer are going to try to funnel around those. So that's how you pick your tree out to get in bow range of these, because you can set up 100 yards down, have a whole bachelor group come through, and you're out of bow range. So once I'm on the ground, this is the kind of stuff I look for as we go through the season.
Stuart, real quick, while you're having this example pull up of all that storm damage, is that something that you can find on an aerial map, or is that something that your boots on the ground looking for that, again, maybe in the summertime, scouting-wise, or throughout the season?
So you can find it in the summertime, and it also applies to bedding areas where you might have more green vegetation grow up because more sunlight's going to penetrate whenever the trees fall down. So yeah, it can apply in early season and even into October. Just trying to find funnel grounds. It can apply there. As far as finding them, it's more of a boots on the ground thing, unless you have had a recent hurricane come through in an area you're familiar with. You're not going to know those trees are falling until you're standing there. So.
I don't want to derail you, but do you get excited if you see a tornado going through some of the public that you like to hunt?
So we don't really get tornadoes in our area. Like a little bit south of here, even here, we'll get them. But as far as like up in the mountains, it's so rare. A lot of that damage is in like August, like September hurricane season. We'll get those winds coming from the south, and I don't know the technology or the science behind it, but a lot of that's on a north-facing slope. So that tends to be where I find those blowdowns. So to answer whoever asked that question about feed sign, this is an example. This is actually from this past August or I think it was September, late September. This is where you can start to key on where the bucks are coming from food to bed. Because when this stuff starts falling, that's a great example. Now, this is a challenging time of year whenever you have all those acorns dropping. You can see from the bottom to the top. There's a little bit of everything there, and I found that just in about 3 hours of scouting, walking through the mountains, everything's dropping. So then you're reduced to the fact that there's not very many limiting factors because bucks can eat anywhere, but it's not like that every year. Some years it's just red oaks, which fall a little bit later. Some years it's just white oaks that will fall on the ground, and within 2 weeks you can find some feed signs. So it's not like that every year in that picture where I found all those. That's a rare occasion there. Here is going to be a little bit better of an area. So this is a time frame where you don't have food everywhere, but I got 2 white oak acorns in my hand and a beech nut right there, all falling in the exact same creek bottom. And then behind me there's a rub. It's not that impressive, but right there when they're losing velvet, you find a lot of rubs like that. So that's an example there where you can key on more of a hot feed tree, that's what everyone calls them these days. So that's somewhere where you can find the trail and then backtrack them to the bed in October. It's hard to see there, but in the mountains, that's actually a lot of good feed sign for me. It's not in areas where there's high deer densities, but in low deer densities, if you find a bunch of those punch holes and tracks in the leaves, that's a hot tree, believe it or not. I don't think I mentioned it in the introduction, but there's not very many deer where I hunt. So here's an example. This is one I actually filmed in early October. It may not be very clear. My editor messed up a little bit, but this is a buck working the edge of the laurel thicket. It's not so thick there as you can see. And the laurel thicket's actually behind him, and then in front of him, there's an example of all those oak trees. So This is a nice 2 or 3 year old 8-pointer that I saw when I was standing on the ground after I shot one. He came walking in. And as you can see, he's working the edge. His right side is the laurels, his left side is the oaks. So there's kind of a visual on where they might work between those feed trees. So when you find an area like that where they're locked in between the bedding and the food, in October it's a lot easier, and September not so much. So this is an example here. This is actually the largest whitetail I've seen in the mountains to this day. This is right before muzzleloader season opened up. But as you can see, as opposed to the A to B, these bucks are much more spread out. This is the biggest buck in the group. I don't know what he would score, but he's the largest one I've seen in the mountains. So here he is. You can tell they're a lot more leisurely feeding along. This is in the evening. And a lot of people think of bachelor groups as hunting them in the summertime or in the early season, but all the way into October, they'll be doing this stuff right here. You can see he's fighting another buck there. He stayed right about the 50-yard mark, and I wasn't able to get a shot on him, and saw him the next morning, and that was the last time I saw him. So just to cover October, that's a good example right there. Sometimes they're in the wide open hardwoods. You don't have to hunt those thickets, and precipitation is a big part of that.
I'm going to say this right now, this is my favorite format for one of the seminars, because we're actually seeing footage of some of these bucks that Stewart's actually hunting on public land. And that last year was a hammer. I don't know if y'all realize that, okay?
He made that one look small. So.
Yeah, absolutely, which is insane. So we're going to kind of open up again for a little more Q&As after talking about October, that pre-rut. What questions you all have, please put your hands up and we'll bring the microphone around, okay? And hold the microphone close to your chin when you're talking as well.
Where was that deer at pin-wise?
If you'll meet me with the afterward, I'll give each and every one of you some coordinates. Y'all can go in there and hammer after. So that was 2 years ago. So go at it, Jacob. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question that Jacob asked me yesterday. So I'm going to see how you answer it versus what I answered. But do you have any, like, hunting feed trees? Is there anything that indicates to you that there might be multiple bucks coming in together? Because I mean, I've had days where I've seen 10 decent, not 10 shooters, 10 bucks one evening and then killed a big one the next morning. But how do you, like, is it just luck when you see 2 or 3 decent bucks together versus just one that comes in after some does? Or is there anything you're looking for to be like, well, there's 2 or 3 shooters in this coming to this tree?
So I'd say, well, sometimes everything feels like luck, just to begin with. But so at this time frame, they're not necessarily on does yet this early. It'll get to that farther on. But as far as when they feel more grouped up or when you might see more than one, a lot of that's just based on timing. So if it's the first week of October, it'll be like the video I just showed. I think I saw 12 bucks there. They weren't all in the frame, somewhere below me. But farther into that, you see them splitting up. And I've actually, 3 years ago, I hunted a deer where when they split up, he hung out with a spike, which I know Jacob would shoot the spike if they walked in rather than the big buck. But he split up and they'll pair up into 2s and 3s. So that would explain why maybe when you're hunting, you see 1 or 2 or a big group, and then you feel like you're seeing a big group sign. And then the next day it's like 2 or 3 and you're not really seeing much after that, just because of the transition of things where it's like there was a group of 12 here, now it's 2 and 3 and 3 at night, 2 in the morning. So that's when it just becomes a bit more hectic. So I think it's important to capitalize between the September when they're all grouped up A to B, and then find them right here when they're starting to lose velvet and spar. That's when it could be really important to get on them.
So how do you play the wind? Do you give the deer the wind? What do you do about thermals?
It's way too early for this question. Okay, so I do pay attention to thermal. I promise everyone I pay attention to thermals because they're what's predictable. But if you listen to Carl Brown talk at all, when he told his milkweed story down on the beach about the milkweed coming back past his face 7 minutes later, that's me in the mountains, because if I paid attention to the wind, I'd never be in the woods. And that's the main thing. I'm telling you, if you focus on the wind, you'll never have an opportunity like this, because if you sit around a campfire, just recreationally, the wind's switching every 5 seconds unless you're on the top of the mountain. So what I try to do is reduce my scent, and I actually asked Tom Brownlee yesterday, like, scientifically, does that apply at all? Because I'm not an expert on the wind. I do kill deer, So I kind of wanted an explanation on that. So as far as scent goes, I don't sweat a lot. I'm not a big guy, so I try to like pace myself as I'm walking in. And then additionally, all my gear stays in a plastic tote. And then I keep fresh leaves from the ground. And then also I'll break off pine branches. You can see there's actually white pines in that screenshot right there. I break those off and change them out as I go throughout the season to reduce my scent and smell like I might have been there a long time ago. And Tom said there might be some merit to that, but I'm not really sure. But if I can make the deer think I'm farther away, that's what I do. And also, like, I've witnessed deer that have come in and bedded near me, and then I've actually got it on video. A bobcat comes in, and the deer's bedded. I see him pick up the scent of the bobcat. He perks up a little bit, looks at the bobcat, settles back down, the bobcat walks off. So I think in low deer density areas where they're not used to like imminent danger, unless you're bumping them, they don't care as much. It's like they'd be running all over the place if they ran at every scent they smelled. So I might change my mind on that one day, but right now my main focus is reduce my scent, hunt when I can, because if I focused on the wind, I'd be going crazy half the time. So that's my best answer on that. We can dive in a little bit more on that, but I think it's a little bit early to dive into that discussion. So that's my best answer there.
So, being a guy who's become fascinated with southern hunting and southern hunters, I gotta ask, you said that you had found a bachelor group of 12 bucks. Diving into all this, I know how hard it is for you guys to key in on these deer early because there's food everywhere, as you just explained. Why do you think you found those deer in that spot that early?
So I can show some pictures of that, but because it's actually coming up in the rest of the video, but the main thing is the concentration of sign and then how fresh it is. Because you might find sign that is made by 12 bucks, but if you're there October 25th and it was made on October 15th, they've already split off in the groups like Greg was talking about, and you're kind of at a loss. So you might run into one still feeding under a tree or such, but the main thing is getting on that sign fresh, and you can tell it's made by that many bucks by the amount of tracks, rubs, and honestly, just scat on the ground. It's all about food at that point. And they're starting to explore a little bit. So once they lose that velvet, that's when they start splitting up. So it's all, in my mind, it's like they're exploring. You can see, I mean, that's probably a 6-year-old deer sparring with a 3-year-old 6-pointer there. They're just, I feel like they're just feeling themselves out because they've been sitting in a cove all summer somewhere. So.
Do you feel like the ratio of buck to doe is kind of skewed towards bucks where you're hunting early season? Or is it pretty 50-50 or more does than bucks typically?
I would say it's what you said initially. It's all skewed toward bucks. There's certain areas I've hunted where in the middle of November, like when they still kind of have their doe fawns with them, I'll see a group of 15, 18 does. But for the most part, what you said first is right. It's a group of big bucks like this, and then I'll see 3 or 4 does. So.
I hunt the mountains as well and have never really had much luck hunting feed trees. I was just curious how big this big buck was to bedding.
How close he was to bedding? From where I think he was bedding, about 250 yards. Now once you get in there, I don't know how spread out they were because sometimes it's like they're all pretty close together, and then depending on how close you are to when they're splitting up, they could be spread throughout a whole laurel thicket. But using the trees like I mentioned, or rocks or different funnels, that's how you find them all congregated like that. But that's just a timing thing. I do think that earlier in the season they're way closer unless it's at nighttime. So catching them in that daylight is like, you gotta be, it's like the first 20 minutes of morning, last 20 minutes of evening, but it's a little bit more lenient in October when they're just relaxed more. I don't know why it is. So into October, once they've started to split up, you'll start seeing a lot of scrapes like this. The licking limb there is a mountain laurel, and then you can see that's pretty torn up there. So initially I would hunt stuff like this because it's really enticing when you see something torn up like that. And when it's really fresh, same with the feed sign, same with the rubs, I would hunt it because there's bucks coming through there. But that becomes old sign really quick. That image is really blurry, but you can see That's one that gets used a little bit more. You can see the tracks in there. For some reason that it's really blurry. But you can see the paw marks and everything. Here's an example of somewhere that might settle into more of a long-term scrape, and this one did. This is in the last week of September. This is actually this past deer season. For some reason, I don't know if it's when you have a good acorn crop or whatever, most of the time I don't see rut activity like this until October. This is at the middle to end of September, and there's a trail coming down a bank right there. I should pan to my left here. That laurel bush is completely destroyed right there, so that's a lot of aggression. And then to the right, there's a scrape, and you can see the urine still fresh in it right there. That right there, I don't see that often in September. Like, it's still like 85 degrees right there. And some people have said that it coordinates with a good food crop coming up, which you saw the picture of all the acorns in my hand. I don't know if that's true or not, but there's a good example of aggression from a mature buck. So that's something that you would want to put a camera on, and I did. So that's just something I'll put a camera on. Here's an example. This is from that isolated scrape. This is just a 3-year-old here, but you can see he doesn't rip the limb apart. He's mainly just using it. In the background, you can actually see a big rub. That's made by a bigger buck. It's a lot higher up the tree. It's a lot bigger diameter. But this is an area that a bachelor group is just using continually. So as we move throughout October, once they've kind of started to split up and they're thinking about a little bit more of that pre-rut time frame, I want to find a scrape like this that does are using. Because those isolated scrapes that just bucks are using, they're not really huntable. I've put cameras on them, and it's like the bucks come once, and then you don't see them again. So if I find a scrape like this, where I've got does coming and actually using the licking limb, like a community scrape, that's historical, and it's also good throughout the entire season. It's not something that you find and then you can't hunt it anymore. I hunted this spot last year from the first week of October, and I'm about to show you why. And I killed a buck there the first week of December. Now I didn't hunt there the whole time. I kind of tried to play around a little bit. But as you can see, it's got this doe group. Now this is it right before daylight in the morning. So they're actually using that fairly consistently for a low deer density area. It's not like you're getting a picture every day. But that scrape is probably 4 to 5 feet wide. The licking limb, you can see, is huge. It's actually hanging off there. So here's the reason why I keyed in on this scrape in this early October. You can see in the back there, this is at the head of a drainage, and this is in the evening. He starts out by circling way down below, kind of sending it out when the thermals are pulling down. This is pretty steep, but you can't tell. Then as he works in, he's super cautious. This is the first set of pictures I got of him as he's working in toward the scrape. You can see him on the left side there, scenting the whole way in. He's got his nose up in that picture. And then once he gets comfortable in there, he's comfortable working the scrape. So that's one that came in right after the does. This is pre-rut, nighttime activity. Luckily, they make some pretty good thermal optics these days, so you can just go in there, right. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I don't own any thermals. But anyway, so right here's an example where he's comfortable, and you can see he's looking at the camera. Years ago, I had a buck that came in, and he looked at the camera, and it just bugged him out. Like, he just freaked out about the camera. I've got a buddy that sets them way down low. I know people set them way up high. I don't like any of that. So what I've started doing is setting them at head height, so you get that good angle like that. And then I brush them in like a blind. So like they blend into the tree really well, and all they see is that infrared flash. I have that camera set to like a low glow, and they don't freak out after that. So going through pre-rut, as you might be shifting off feed trees, this is what keeps me in the game, because it's easy to get distracted or discouraged out there when you're not seeing many deer. But if you have a camera showing you this kind of stuff, it kind of keeps you out there when you're not seeing many deer. As good as this looks, this is like gold out there for me. I don't see this all the time unless it's a historical spot like this. So you got to put a lot of boot leather on the ground to find a spot like this. So this is like the question Chris asked. This is an example of an area where you might know that a lot of bucks are coming through, where you have like a cluster of rubs like this. But this was in a creek bottom. This is not something that really concerns me that much, because I know there's bucks in the area, so I might need to hone in a little bit more. But as far as hunting right there, it's in a creek bottom. It's probably done at night. Not that interesting to me to like put a stand on right at that moment. There's a whip rub there. It's all broken off. It's kind of hard to see. Here's something with a little bit more aggression. This is actually up a ridge, not at a creek bottom. This is closer to somewhere I might focus on. He pawed the ground here and then also rubbed right there beside it. So that's an example of somewhere I might try to key on out of the bottoms, farther up the ridge, closer to where he might be bedding. This is a historical rub, just like the scrapes. You can see the left side of it's all black there. This is something that probably gets rubbed every year because they're small, they get rubbed, they heal over that spot, and then it's rubbed again right there in the middle of October. And you can see it's all the way up past my bow. That's probably 4 feet off the ground, up above my bow. So that's a good area to key on where a big buck might be using it. This next slide's pretty interesting. So this is on National Forest, and when I first walked up on this, I thought this has got to be an absolute giant. Because I hung my hat on it for reference, but it's like probably as big as that speaker right there. So I got a camera out of my truck as fast as I could and hung it on this, and it was does and spikes and like little fork horns rubbing that huge tree, and it was just a signpost rub. So it wasn't even these big bucks coming through, it was just small deer and does basically using it like a scrape, just rubbing their forehead on it. So sometimes you have those false rubs that you think are giants, and it turns out to be that.
So when you come upon them scrapes like that, how do you know whether the does are using it other than just put the camera on? I mean, are you looking for a doe track in the scrape?
So two things. The size of it, number one, if they're smaller, like the size of a basketball, maybe 2 feet wide, that's like going to be like that first image I showed. I don't really care about those because I've put cameras on them and they're dead. I mean, it doesn't matter. They're just dead. I might get a button buck come through. So the two things I would say is tracks in the scrape, like you mentioned. That's a good starting point because that's pretty obvious depending on what the soil looks like, and then the size of it. So when I see one that's like 3, 4, 5, 6 feet wide with not necessarily multiple licking limbs, but you can see that one has just been used to pieces. It's not just bucks using it, it's does too. It's 100%.
So you're talking about the cluster rubs, how they were in the bottom, you don't pay much attention to them. What about when they're up on the end of a ridge? What do you think about them?
So the end of a ridge is good. I've heard people talk about military crest, and like a lot of these modern terms I don't really know about because I hear them on podcasts, but I don't always know the actual definition of them. So the end of a ridge is really good because they'll bed on those. Here's another term, a thermal hub. A lot of times off the end of a ridge, you have a creek bottom with multiple drainages coming together. So at the end of that ridge, you're at the upper third or top of that thermal hub. Because I don't think they like being down there. I think the predators prefer that because that is where all that scent pulls up, and a deer would just be confused down there. So on top of a ridge, not so much. In the mountains, they don't really travel at the tops of ridges, but on the end of one, they'll bed on those where they can catch kind of the thermals that pull up, but not be down in them. So that's a good question, actually. I think I would focus on that if it had that aggression to it. Okay, so moving into November, this is a good time to kill a buck. It's easier than September, but it's not as good as late season for me. But it's a good time to kill one. The problem is when you have a buck coming to a scrape like the one I showed, it tends to be a wild card. Everything kind of goes out the window. Because once the does start coming into estrus, the bucks start moving around a lot more. I don't know if you listened to the latest episode of the Southern Outdoorsman, where they kind of displayed some of the numbers from the MSU study. But a light bulb clicked for me because I prefer hunting later rut, which we'll get to. But in November, when the bucks are just kind of running everywhere, I like to hunt throughout the day because you never know when one might come through midday. The rest of the year, I'm more of a morning and evening guy. But here's an example. In November, now this is the mountains. Y'all might hunt somewhere else, but it can apply to you as well. You just got to determine what your cover types are. So this is all a big cluster of mostly laurel. There's probably some pine and hemlock mixed in. And then you have your isolated patches, your salt and hardwoods, and then some kind of more patches of laurel over here. And then you can see right here there's a drainage coming up. Now when this switches to LiDAR, you'll be able to see the funnels between the two types of cover. So right here, you have all these micro drainages that come up, and then right there, that's rocks, which is so crazy. Like 5 or 6 years ago, that this didn't exist, and I was using some really crappy, I don't know if it was LiDAR or what it was, but you would never see a rock outcropping like that. So That's a good example of a rut funnel between bedding on the left, huge bedding on the right, and then in that area you have those micro drainages, and then also that rock outcropping. So you can hunt on that. They'll even bed in the rock sometimes when it's really cold. It's more of a late season thing because they tend to hold a little bit of heat than other areas. So that's a good example of a rut funnel, but like I said, everything kind of goes out the window and you're just hoping for the best. There's an example of what some of that cover looks like. That's rhododendron. Some people in the mountains interchange that with mountain laurel. I don't hunt that at all. I don't like it. If you've ever walked through it, you probably never did it the second time. They don't eat this stuff. They'll eat mountain laurel in a hard winter. I've gutted bucks and found mountain laurel leaves in them. This stuff's a bit different. It grows a bit more like a vine, and if you've walked through it, you probably won't do it again. So that's an example of the cover that grows more in the bottoms. This is what it looks like, kind of a little bit up higher. It's kind of just looks like a jungle. So those types of covers between areas can be good, but I would rather hunt the open areas between the two because you can't get a shot on a deer in that anyways. So this is an example of a November scrape. Bucks, a lot of times, they'll hang out over them in the morning times like this one. Now this is a younger deer, it's probably a 2 or 3 year old, but it's a good example of one camping out on a scrape early in the morning. So this is the time of year I'll get in the stand like 30 minutes before sunrise because when this stuff's going on, I'd rather be set up and come in at that gray light to scoop them off of it, even though that's not a big buck there. But you tend to see more stuff like this. Does running through mid-morning. There's a buck working a scrape. You just see a lot more of that crazy activity where it's kind of unpatternable. There's one there winding. So there's a laurel thicket to his left, a drainage in front of him. This is mid-morning in November. So I think thermals play a big role here because he's standing over top of this drainage kind of winding. And that's just a good November thing where I showed that example between a funnel between thickets. So that's a buck I didn't shoot. Here's a doe being ran right here. Her tongue's hanging out. This is like peak breeding. There's a buck that Jacob Emery would pull the trigger on right about now. And he runs her into that thicket. You see where it gets shady and dark there? That's all laurel. So you're not going to shoot a deer in there, but hunting the edges of it, you're able to get your shot in November because stuff's just kind of crazy then. So that's a good example of kind of that peak breeding, like middle of November. So my video messed up there. It should correct in a second. But this is December, the first week of December, and this might be different for wherever you hunt in whatever region of the country. But this is my favorite time, and this also coincides with the podcast that the Southern Outdoorsman did, where they see bucks kind of come back to their home range and bed in more specific areas. And I think it's when they're honing in on the doe groups. The craziness of November's kind of settled down, and I don't know if it's fawns coming into the estrus cycle or what, but this is where I kill all my big bucks, like the ones that are hanging over there. This is the time of year that I kill them. And this is all focusing on kind of the same stuff as November, like the heads of drainages, but it's just a lot less crazy. So when you get a buck on camera, you can kind of bank on going and hunting him because he's not running everywhere. The same with the doe groups. If I have a doe like peeing in a scrape or whatever, I mean, you might want to call off work or something and go hunt it there the next morning because there's a good chance they'll be running back and forth. So this is an example of a doe group. This is the December 9th, a couple years ago. It was frigid cold this morning. I think it was like 6 or 8 degrees. This is the north facing slope. Now this isn't a big buck. I ended up shooting him. This is probably 7 years ago. And he came in. I had a doe group come through at the top of the drainage. In a minute you'll see the bluff that was at the head of the drainage. He worked through downwind of the does and gave me like a 30-yard shot. And once again, this is December, past our peak rut, but he's still focused in on the does. So that's a good example there. A lot of the bigger bucks I've killed I don't have on video because I tend to panic and don't even think about the camera whenever a mature one walks in. But that was a 2 or 3 year old acorn that I killed. So there's a picture I took with him. There's a huge rock face there. That was about 50 yards below, and he was walking right above that. So there's an example where you can kind of get out of the craziness of November and catch one traveling the exact same area. And just like the trees, that rock's just as good of a funnel as well. Okay, so this I actually added in last minute. I wasn't sure how long this was going to go, but I wanted to give an example that's different from just hunting the mountains, because not everyone hunts that, and this might be boring to some people. But this is an example of a hunt I went on last year where I applied for a quota hunt, still in Georgia, but this is more toward the middle part of the state, so there's a lot less topography, but there's a little bit more variety. So I went down there on a Thursday, the hunt started on Friday, but this particular property got logged a lot, and I made sure before the hunt to do a little bit of research on it, see how many people hunted it, see what the statistics were. So going into it, I knew that pressure was going to be a factor, so what I ended up doing was picking the backside of this clear cut, and I got there on a Thursday and scouted it. Found some decent sign back there, some rubs in the bottom behind it, and then after I got back to my truck, I ended up kind of second guessing it once it got dark. So there was a main parking area not far from there. I slept in my truck not far from it, and then the next morning I just parked on the side of the road after freezing in my truck all night, and I hiked all the way across that clear cut, got to the back of it, and I was trying to pick out a tree in the moonlight to set up in, and a voice said something, and I paused because I thought it was like God talking to me or something, but a guy was already back there that had circled from some other direction. I don't know where he came from, so we talked for a minute and I moved out of there. So I already knew there was going to be a lot of pressure because that was probably 30 minutes before sunrise. So I went to a different area, set up there, also using the pressure to my advantage from a parking lot, and a buck came in. So I wanted to include this to show that you can apply some of these same tactics whenever you're going into an area to still kill a buck. So this is an example. Someone asked, or you asked about scent control. This is a great example. My wind was blowing toward the creek bottom away from a clear cut. I'm like 2 sticks up at this point because I didn't get in until after daylight after running into that guy. This would have been a legal buck, but I let him walk. He walks in, doesn't see me, catches my thermals pulling down in that creek bottom, looks directly at me, and then keeps walking. So I know he's a young buck, he's not a mature buck, but there's an example of where I got away with something as far as scent control. Here's a group of does on the edge of planted pines. The other side of them is where that guy was hunting. I was over this direction. So potentially his wind pushed those deer to me. I don't know that for a fact, but I would like to think that's what happened. So they came off the edge of those planted pines. I'm hunting the edge of this clear cut, and this is probably about 8:30 in the morning, so not long after daylight. And then I eventually, this buck ends up coming in, and I kill him. So the same tactics you apply in the mountains over the whole season can be applied when you're going on a trip, because even though there might be not seem to be limiting factors, if you can factor in hunting pressure, the time of year, what they're feeding on, whether or not it's rut, a lot of times it can all come together like this one did, even though this felt a little bit like luck because the first spot I went to didn't work out. Who knows, it might have worked out in the first spot too, but this buck was working the edge of the clear cut, the does were on the other side of him, my wind was good, and I was able to kill him. So I'd just like to say in closing that out of all the tactics out there that is kind of in the whitetail world today, I think the main thing is putting time in the woods and like learning from the whitetail deer, because you can listen to me up here or anyone else on a podcast and try to get some knowledge, but what it all comes down to is learning from the whitetail, kind of seeing what they're doing in real time and staying on that sign. And kind of adjusting as you go out through the season. So there he is going down, falling right there in the creek bottom. But I just wanted to include that in there because I didn't want to leave out any of the other guys that don't hunt the mountains. Because if you're traveling like I did for that quota hunt, there's certain things you can do to kind of narrow it down. And I killed on the first morning. It could be luck or whatever, but those are the processes I went through to have that buck down. And I was heading home by lunch that day. So. It's not always going to work out that way, but those are some of the sort of the processes I go through when I'm planning an out-of-state or an out-of-county hunt even. So as a point of wrapping up, I would just say as you go throughout your deer season, it's important to stay on the sign, be in the woods, and whether it's raining or too cold or whatever, just be out there, because that's what it comes down to. If you're the guy that quits hunting in November, you might miss out on a good buck.
All right, real quick, we're gonna go over some Q&As because I've got personally some questions, but I want to open it for you guys first. Stewart's had a fantastic presentation, not only the topics he's talking about, but actually showing us these specific hunts and how they actually work. So we're going to go through the room and figure out, what questions y'all have. So all you got to do is put your hand up, and we'll bring that mic around. So feel free to ask any specific question you'd like to get into in any kind of detail, and we'll go over it. Okay? So who wants to kick us off? Just throw your hand up. Right there. Southern Outdoorsman plays orange. Lucky hat.
That's a lucky hat. Yeah.
Good job with that.
Did you do that, JJ?
I noticed you mentioned a lot of references to north-facing slopes, particularly in the warmer months. Do you find that transitions to southern-facing slopes when it gets cooler around December, January? Or are they still tending to be more on those northern-facing slopes?
So that's a really good question, and I thought that for a long time. Once again, listening to podcasts, because I do that like everyone else does. I thought for sure that it would flip and be the opposite, because those stay really shady all throughout the day, like even until the afternoon when the sun finally hits them. I actually asked Tom Brownlee about this yesterday regarding scent, but I thought that would have a change, like maybe that they wouldn't want to seek warmer temperatures like they do when they bed in those rocks. But the video I showed of the buck that I killed above that big rock, that was a north-facing slope. That was 9:30 in the morning, shady as can be. My breath was freezing over that morning. It was like 7 or 8 degrees. They're all walking the north-facing slope. I can't explain that, but I do know that as far as targeting the whole south-facing thing, as a limiting factor, and I just took it right out because I killed that buck. There was does there. It's cold as can be. So yeah, it might apply in some areas, but I don't think about it much anymore.
When you were referring to the bucks get like more inconsistent, like when they start chasing, they're more spread out. Do you think you'd be better off still hunting than sitting?
That's actually a really good question. It's funny you asked that your thought process went to there, because in November, a lot of the hunts that I do are wildlife management area hunts, which aren't corner hunts like this where they're limited to smaller properties. But in the mountains, you'll have like a 3 or 4 day weekend where they open up a piece of property that might be 20 or 30,000 acres, and you can go in there and hunt for that period of time. They're not really any better than like the national forest that I hunt. The bigger bucks that I've killed are on national forest. But during November, that's a really good question. I don't have the videos up here today, but I've killed bucks doing exactly what you're talking about. Because when they're running crazy like that, you can go from funnel to funnel to funnel, checking to see if there's those does that they're chasing around. Because a lot of times, especially in the peak breeding, you'll have 2 or 3 bucks on her, and they'll stand for a half an hour staring at each other. I don't know why they do it, but they'll have the doe in the thicket. She's all by herself. And the bucks will just stand there. It'll be a standstill. I actually have video of that. So whenever you're in that time when the bucks are inconsistent, you can still hunt through areas like that and walk up on them just walking and kill one doing exactly what you're talking about. So well, yeah, whenever you're out of that regular pattern, you're not going to hurt anything by going and trying a new area, focusing on the same terrain features, and you might have one run one past you or walk right up on 3 bucks on one doe. So that's a good question. Does anyone else have any questions? One right here.
So you're hunting bedding to bedding. Are you hunting benches or are you hunting leads that come down?
So that's different situation. And it changes a little bit, but it all depends. So people tend to focus on terrain features a lot, which they are a good thing, but if the habitat isn't there, it doesn't matter. So like the LiDAR images I showed, you could have a drainage with a bench and a rock outcropping, and then you get there and it's like all poplar trees. It doesn't matter. So that would be a good thing to focus on. Like they all can kind of work together. So it's not necessarily one or the other. It's more like both coming together at the same time. So if you have a bench and you go to that bench and the bucks are bedding there because it's really steep and the habitat's good, like they have that native vegetation or a dropping oak tree or beech nut or whatever, if they both come together, that's what you're looking for. Anyone else? You're not more nervous than I am, so if you want to say something, go for it.
Okay, so I think you brought up something that I hadn't thought about, but scrapes. It sounds like you're maybe keying in on scrapes that are a little bit more like aggressive or for like a larger buck. Is that correct? Is that what you find, like the scrapes that are more aggressive that have the scrape that have the rub there and it just looks a little bit more aggressive? Are you keying in on those more just for bigger buck purposes, or do you finding that bigger bucks are making those?
So in my area, absolutely. I like that video I showed with the urine still on the scrape. I want to see the aggression because that, number one, he's comfortable there if he's sitting there ripping a bush up. And like in the picture I showed, that tree was torn apart, limbs were hanging down. Like whenever I would go check that camera, I'd grab the limbs and then set them back up on top of that laurel bush just so that they were still there with all the deer scent on them. So most of the time, yes. Actually, yesterday I had a conversation with Gabe from Arkansas, and he was showing me kind of a buck that he was after that consistently made these scrapes under beech trees. And he found that one of the scrapes was just a barely any paw mark. It was all licking limb, like nothing on the ground. So he started keying in on that and noticing just licking limb throughout the core area, setting cameras on those, the ground was being hauled up, and he ended up killing that buck. So I'd say it kind of varies back and forth, but in my area, I want the aggression, the big pawed out ground.
All right, guys, well, that's going to wrap up our final seminar for the day. Again, I guess we can do a round of applause for Stewart. It was a fantastic presentation. If y'all have any other questions, feel free to come find Stewart. Again, we'll be here for about another 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Yep, and then we're going to go over to Whiskey Cowgirl tonight. So we're going to go up to Chattanooga, Whiskey Cowgirl bar. It's a really fun spot. We went there last year. So feel free to go grab some dinner and feel free to stop by because a lot of these guys are going to be there tonight. Thank y'all.